questions start arising when the bloodless bodies start piling up after a single man and his little girl move into the apartment complex. So that's basically the story of Let the Right One In, the Swedish original, and then remade as Let Me In. I'm John Chang with Dan Dedwitz.
Hi there.
So I thought this time around the question might be kind of more related to what we talked about before, and we'll certainly get into this in this discussion about how we tend to have this association with childhood and innocence and stuff, but what happens, I guess, when it becomes something pretty sinister, I guess, and I think certainly it seems to be territory for like movies like Damien Omen, and then of course this movie and stuff like that. Yeah, and we kind of talked about it before too about kind of the last one was Solid Precinct 13, and even like kind of the Silent Night, Deadly Night movies.
Yeah. I mean, I think where this stems from in terms of movies is really the question. I think it comes from the psychological roots of nature versus nurture, in terms of having this question of, is morality naturally inherent to us, or is it something that we learn? And so I think that's kind of where you get these movies like The Omen and this. I think that's where they're pulling this from. And I think in this movie in particular, it's kind of an interesting question because you have the two main characters are kind of showing both sides of that. You've got Ellie, who is the vampire, who is sort of evil by nature, so to speak. And you've got Oskar, who's, the product of a broken family, bullying and being an outcast, who's become sort of emotionally withdrawn and violent as a result of his environment, you might say. So you kind of got these two opposite poles. So yeah, I think that's kind of, and it's always sort of very, I don't know, shocking, or would be maybe a bit of a strong word for it, but to see, children acting in ways that are sort of dangerous or highly immoral is very kind of unsettling to watch that kind of things, which they tapped into with The Omen.
Another movie that I kind of saw that really references this was My Friend Dahmer, which, we kind of know Jeffrey Dahmer to a degree of based on his reputation as a serial killer. And My Friend Dahmer was basically, it started off as a graphic novel of a friend of his from high school that basically saw this kid and, didn't know, saw the signs, so to speak, and stuff. And granted, nothing happened to him and stuff, which is, kind of how he ended up, writing this graphic novel. But it was pretty detailed and showing how, just these things, these strange things that he did and everything. And so I think what I'm saying there is that, sometimes the nature part is how, you can have a child who is, basically a psychopath. I mean, and, they've shown that, psychopaths, and sociopaths, their brains are different, that where, they don't have the empathy and stuff like that. And then, usually it is some kind of events that trigger it and kind of move things forward, which is, kind of the whole premise of the Dexter series too and stuff that he was somebody who was, kind of had the genes to be, a, social or psychopath, I guess, and stuff. And then, it was this kind of brutal killing that, just triggered things for him and stuff. And so I think that's what's interesting is that, even if the person has this kind of, brain chemistry or whatever, something like that, makes them lean towards a certain way, often it is kind of, the environment, it is the nurture part that kind of propels things forward as well.
Absolutely. And I think this movie sort of plays with sort of child development and the issues around it in lots of different ways. Because you've got, you've got basically Ellie, who is a 12-year-old who's stuck at that age, basically, and that stage of development. So it's kind of, she's not really an adult, she's not really a child yet. She's probably, it's sort of hinted at, she's obviously much older than she says she is. likewise, you've got Oskar dealing with lots of different sort of environmental sort of issues for him with his parents and society and stuff. But then you've also got the bully, whose brother is bullying him, and you have this sort of inherited kind of behavior. So, and I think it's this inheritance of behavior that's actually one of the more interesting things in this movie. For me, the relationship between Oskar and his dad is really, really interesting. There's a lot of points, especially in the original, that had me sort of going away and thinking about it. Because obviously Oskar is kind of an outcast, and he's quite withdrawn, not very assertive, and is kind of like he is subject to his peers and their sort of abuses of him. And it may not have been totally obvious, but there's a scene that's very telling in the original with the dad, where this guy just turns up randomly when Oscar's round there and says, "Oh, okay. Oh, I see Oscar's here. Oh, let's get the drinks out." And because what they're implying there is basically his dad's an alcoholic, and he's completely dependent on it, which is why he's so far removed from the town and everything else. And so his dad is also like a subject to obviously peer pressure and kind of, got trapped in some kind of cycle there. So, and what's interesting for me is that Oskar, even though he gets rid of the bullies and overpowers them, he's kind of just being submissive and being pressured into another situation by Ellie. Ultimately,
that's true.
So it's kind of just a case of there's also this question is, if you're too far gone down a road of particular personality traits, maybe you're just swapping one bully for another, and you just, there really isn't much you can do to change these things about you, regardless of self-improvement books or whatever.
Yeah, it's interesting how on the surface it seems like this kind of childhood romance and stuff like that, and it's kind of course in the remake they kind of really really drive the point home. We'll talk more about that, but in reality, it's in a way, like what's interesting is that like initially we think that the older man, in this case his name is Hakan and stuff, is the dad, but then over time we realize he's just this kind of minion and stuff like that basically Oskar is going to become. So like that's something that like we forget about that like it seems like these two kids falling in love or whatever, but really Ellie is just creating somebody else to serve her bidding and stuff like that. I mean, that's really what we're seeing, and we don't realize that, of course, until the ending. Like kind of that's like kind of the cycle is going to be repeated and stuff like that. And, of course, as always, major spoilers. We should have said that right off the bat.
Yes, of course, yeah. We should always have that as part of some crawl at the beginning of each of our videos. But yeah, I mean that for me was actually one of the most interesting things about this movie was the relationship between Eli and Hakan and how that sort of reflected it with Oskar, because it harks back to a more classical kind of interpretation of the vampire story, which is this this thing that a vampire has such sort of kind of instinctual kind of control over people that they can make them do things that their will through this kind of sort of lust that is almost beyond sexuality. That's the kind of thing that I've always found interesting about vampires. It's kind of like, and it's very well represented in this, is that it's a kind of love affair that is sexless in a way, and it goes beyond sexuality, and is kind of so. But yeah, anyway, getting back to, we'll get onto that later, I guess. But Hakan is really interesting because you get the impression at some stage he was Oskar.
Yeah.
And he's now her minion and is going out and killing these people. But there's also a part of him that's kind of a bit like a predatory pedophile, because he's out there killing generally kind of young men to sort of feed her habit. And you kind of, this is also kind of like in the book, but not so much in the movies, although it's kind of hinted at in the original. And that is that Ellie may not actually be a girl. In the book, she is actually a boy, and she's been castrated in the books.
Yeah.
So there is this kind of gender identity sort of question that comes up more in the books and the movies.
Right.
So in a way, you kind of think, is he trying to kind of copy the behavior of Ellie in a way by killing these people? Maybe he's hoping that will bring him closer to Ellie. So, but likewise, it's kind of it's obviously is a very strange relationship if you've fallen in love as a 12-year-old and your partner stays a 12-year-old. It's like, that's and or it may, we don't even know that really. I don't think there's any. He may just be a predatory kind of really dangerous kind of predatory pedophile who enjoys killing teenage boys and is just sort of doing it for the kick of it. And she has the bonus of being able to sort of drain their blood in the process.
And something else we kind of get more into in with the remake and stuff is that like it's hinted that like he's just kind of tired of like kind of doing it, whereas in the original he doesn't seem very good. He doesn't seem very competent. No. I mean, he's kind of very sloppy and kind of like almost like just basically just waiting to get caught and stuff.
Yeah, they nail the slopiness much better in the original than they do in the remake. The remake, he just kind of seems to be tired and just makes really stupid mistakes. Seems to make genuinely just bad judgment calls in the original. But yeah, I think the other sort of slightly more effective things, and the thing I liked about this is the way that the way the movie's shot is very kind of still and quite sort of somber. Like there's not very much dynamic visual action in terms of character movement or anything like this. And when there is something dangerous, it comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Just like this thing of when he first confronts his first victim and he just goes, "Hi there, you got the time?" And he goes, "Sure. Hey, what's that?" I go, "Oh, it's a Peloton around," and then just proceeds to kind of knock him out and cut his throat. It's very kind of polite and genial. And likewise, when Oskar attacks his bully, it's just they're both just standing there, and all of a sudden just thwack, and his ears bleeding. It kind of everything is quite sort of static, more or less, and this kind of echoes this whole feeling of almost like a lack of humanity, a lack of emotion. Everything is very cold and static, and so this vampire who is just kind of dead and basically emotionless kind of fits right in that kind of environment.
Yeah, we should point out that the original was set in Sweden and stuff, like a suburb of Stockholm and stuff. And that is very much part of, like kind of the story. And we'll certainly see it again in the remake and stuff like that. And I feel like, the other movie that really, I wouldn't say copies, but is kind of this reminds me of is the 40 Days of Night, where it's set in Alaska, where like kind of this 40 days of night literally and stuff like that, and so the vampires can like kind of run free because there's no sun to kind of until at the end of the 40 days and stuff like that, and which really sets a really cool premise because you have a small town. Which we talked about many times about, how that really tightens things for horror and stuff. And then, the fact that like, no daylight to worry about and stuff. It's like kind of, it's just really dramatic to kind of have. And the other part I think is like having a winter scene, when there's blood splattering, I mean, that red really shows up, that's another interesting aspect.
Yeah, and I think visually it reminded me, the only other movie I can think of is something like Sympathy for Lady Vengeance, which has got a lot of kind of, from what I remember, blood shedding on snow and things like this, or red against kind of very white backgrounds and things. So yeah, it's very effective. There's also a lot of shots, both in the remake and the original, where they've just got one very strong single light source that gives it this very kind of, again, kind of statuesque. Yeah.
Definitely.
Image, so yeah. Yeah. So I think there was quite a lot of the dialogue as well is quite sort of slow and static, I would say, in the original, but it has a very naturalistic feel to it that I don't think the remake quite nails. But a lot of the conversation seems, it seems very natural, given the circumstance of what they're trying to kind of portray, which I thought was really, really well done.
I think one other thing to kind of that's worth mentioning is how it's interesting how both movies chose to use the 80s as time frame too. I guess part of it is then you're not dealing with social media, cell phones, and all that kind of stuff, because both are made in the 2000s. So the later the part of the first decade of the 2000s, and I think it's kind of like by then technology has really started taking hold, and I think some of these filmmakers and so on realize that like a lot of things start going out the window with the technology and stuff.
Yeah. No, I think it, definitely from a technological perspective, it simplifies things. But I think also it gives you kind of a slightly semi-autobiographical kind of take on some of the issues of being a child in the 80s might have been, bullying could have gone sort of like unchecked quite easily in a lot of places. So it gives you an opportunity to explore that quite a lot. And also, helicopter parenting probably wasn't quite so prevalent. Kids were allowed to go out and play at night and do all this stuff by themselves. So, I'm guessing you can get that. And
I was going to say like that the whole Atlanta, the serial killings hadn't happened yet, so there still wasn't that kind of, like you said, the same fears as
Yeah, and I think that's what's more what I liked about the original was a lot of the things that happen in terms of the killing. Because it's the dead of winter, there's no police around anywhere. It does feel slightly kind of it feels like you're out in the middle of the nowhere. There isn't really much of a police presence, hence why you have like the character of Lack, I can't remember his name, but the one who's basically who tries to go and sort of kill Ellie in her house. He's basically kind of like meting out community justice for his friend, because no one else is doing anything about it. Whereas obviously they flip that in the remake, but yeah, I mean so there's this kind of feeling of like you're very isolated because there's this lack of any kind of oversight of people's behavior in the town.
I think it just really part of it is like kind of we're talking about Sweden stuff, and it's kind of already more sparsely populated, but then definitely the timing kind of just adds to the era really adds to the fact that like it's just not the same kind of things that are around that nowadays and stuff. So I guess it's like both. It's like both the in the 80s there's not the technology, but then also there wasn't in some places like the same policing and stuff like that. So.
Well, people wouldn't have thought there would have been any need for it, I guess, is a simple answer to that, because small communities do tend to manage themselves until Stephen King came along and ruined it for everyone. But I mean, the other thing that I think we're looking at with this movie, I mean, I didn't really find it very scary. I don't know about you, but I didn't find the second one maybe slightly more scary, but I found it more like a tragic kind of coming of age love story than horror movie per se.
Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about it. Yeah, it's even though it's horror in terms of genre and stuff like that, but I'd say it definitely is a lot more of a romance and stuff like that. And it's again it's kind of seems on the surface to be like a childhood romance and stuff like that, and with the coming of age kind of idea. But definitely I feel like it's, if anything, there's more this kind of mood and just this kind of sense that like something is kind of happening, and so and we kind of know like kind of from the fact that like I mean it doesn't take us too long to figure out that like Ellie isn't what she appears to be and stuff like that. And I thought the other thing that was kind of interesting was this idea that here we have adults kind of like basically when a child is like a psychopathic killer with a bloodlust and stuff like that, and really like, like never mind just kind of ordinary parenting, kind of, like, oh, like kind of, this is my child and I'll, defend her to the end. So like, but here, it's just the idea that I think of where, how far do we go, right? When like, your kid is a blood sucking fiend and stuff. Where do you draw the line as to like how far you go for them?
Yeah, true. I mean, well, that's on the basis that it's even, a parent and not an old friend or an old sort of lover, so to speak. So yeah, I mean, it's yeah, and I think it's kind of, there's one thing I always think about that's kind of interesting with horror movies is when I think about slasher movies in the 80s, it's just kind of some sort of monster going around killing sort of naked teenage girls. So I often sort of like to sort of flip it and say, okay,
right.
Let's replace the violence with sex, or
Right.
let's replace the sex with violence and see what kind of outcome we get. And I mean, in this one, if you kind of, if you take away her killing, she could just it could be almost like an analogy for a very sort of over-sexualized teenage girl, really. It could be, and how that is a kind of misunderstood by society, perhaps, or she might be seen as something dangerous in a way. It's, you could kind of flip the theme of it a little bit like that, to see how that works.
And this also gets back a little bit to what we talked about with I Am Legend, which is like, here is something that like, it's not human stuff. She says, like, I'm not a girl and stuff like that. And, like, even though like part of it is the reference to, kind of the fact in the source material, she's a boy and stuff like that. But it's also the fact that like, she's this creature now, like kind of that lives on blood, and she just needs to live, or she wants to live and stuff like that. And, in our society, she's a monster, but, different times, like kind of, it's interesting because those kids, right, the bullies are really monsters to, Oskar and stuff like that. And, just like in I Am Legend, human beings would be the monsters if like, these creatures start, thriving, and so to speak, because even in, like kind of at one point, she turns the one, girlfriend slash wife, into, one of her own. So like, and, but she chooses not to like kind of live like that, whatever. But, like kind of what we see though, is that like, she could make more, other creatures by biting them, stuff like that, which is of course part of the vampire lore. And, it's not really spoken of in this movie, but it's hinted that, there are others like herself and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, you get the impression that she's vaguely conscientious and she doesn't just sort of create an army of vampires and take over Stockholm. But yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of this whole question of vampires and how they, like you said, she's not actually identifying as a girl anymore, even if you regardless of that. And it's this idea that vampires have this kind of this love or this sort of desire or passion that goes beyond sexuality in a way. It's kind of this sort of genderless sort of power of love over people, which I thought was really cool in this one. I think as well, it's kind of, I mean, it's fairly explicitly kind of shown in the original, because there's the bit where he sneaks the view at her, and there's this kind of I don't know, it looks like a weird sort of mutilated
Crying
vagina.
Yeah,
and it's, they didn't, and I knew, well, I'll save that for the discussion of the remake, but suffice. But anyway, so I mean, but there's this, vampires have kind of, they've how they've been used in stories seems to have kind of mutated or transformed over the years, because rather than them being this thing that's kind of an immortal danger that only comes out at night and preys on people while they're asleep, when they're the most sort of vulnerable, they've become more of a kind of analogy for outcasts or people who don't fit into the mold of society. So, and a more kind of simplistic interpretation of that might be giving them just superpowers, like in
the Twilight
Underworld.
Series. Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, Twilight or Underworld. But I'd say Twilight
right.
kind of sits in the middle of those because the vampires are kind of like the teenage outcasts who are just kind of misunderstood but can't fit into a normal sort of society.
Yeah.
Then layered on top of that, in this one, you've got this kind of coming of age thing where, you know, this boy is starting to sort of have feelings for girls and stuff, and likewise. But you could also sort of say it's an analogy for dysfunction, because in a way, you know, she's obviously, in a funny sort of way, I mean, something pretty horrendous must have happened to her to become a vampire at the age of 12 and lose her parents and everything else. And so she's kind of, in a way, there's this kind of intrinsic link, maybe not so much in terms of vampirism in general, but in this movie, you've got this kind of father figure, maybe, who's then sort of preying on kids. You've got her, who's a kid that's preying on adults. And you've got Oskar, who sort of wants to be like a predator, or it's kind of been neglected by adults. So there's this kind of these weird sort of cycles of neglect and kind of predatory behavior in a way. And in a way, actually, if you think about it, Ellie is actually, if you think about her as 100 or 200-year-old vampire, she's actually kind of like grooming Oskar, really. I mean, she's kind of a child predator in a way, because she knows, you know, she can probably make a lifelong minion by manipulating him. And also, you know, she actively plays and manipulates people's sort of impressions of a weak girl for her feeding, like she does in the tunnel and stuff. So there's this weird kind of cyclical kind of nature of these themes in the characters in this, I think.
Yeah, the strong versus the weak theme, I felt like the remake actually brought that out more somehow. I guess that's probably like a good time to transition to that, because you know, let's face it, we talked referenced it quite a bit already, and I think part of the reason why is that it's not a shot-for-shot remake, which kind of I felt refreshing, but a lot of the key plot points are the same, a lot of the key scenes are the same and stuff like that. You know, here we have Chloe Grace Moretz as Abby as the vampire stuff. Richard Jenkins again, who we saw, in a couple of movies now, a couple of remakes, is now the adult Thomas. And then now instead of Oskar, we have Owen, who is ends up being Nightcrawler in the X-Men series. Is
it? Okay.
Yeah,
Didn't realize that. Okay.
It's Matt Reeves is the writer, kind of director of this one and stuff like that, and he did this after Cloverfield and stuff because he really just liked the the original movie and stuff like that. But yeah, for the most part, it's pretty faithful to the original, for better for worse and stuff like that. But it does still have a few surprises, which actually that's the part I did like, that they didn't just didn't copy everything and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I think it takes a lot of the sort of effective drama from the original. Whilst it does make a few changes, it doesn't really mess around with it too much.
No.
It's got more money to play with, so it throws in a lot more 80s songs. The effects and gore, the gore is much more effective and things like this. And so it's obviously got a higher production value. If I had to prefer one over the other, I think I prefer the more kind of static, kind of weird, unnatural vibe of the original. But it's a very sort of serviceable remake, I would say. It's pretty decently done. And we watched, what else did we watch by Matt Reeves recently? We watched another remake that he did. I'm trying to remember what it was.
Oh, I'm trying to think now.
Because he's doing the new Batman movie soon, but there was something we watched recently by him as well. I think he wrote it.
Well, he did the future ones of the Planet of the Apes series and stuff.
That's right, War of the Planet of the Apes. I knew we'd seen his name before. So, and I would say the bullying is maybe a little bit harsher in this as well. It seems it's kind of a little more aggressive. So I don't know. I think I felt that theme was a bit more emphasized in this compared to the original.
I thought so too, and I felt like what we're really kind of getting to is this idea of which I think you kind of mentioned offline. We mentioned it about this idea of like kind of predators have a need to just basically dominate and stuff, you know, like kind of that they, you know, want to be the apex and stuff like that. And, you know, so bullying is essence, like kind of, you know, on the one hand, we see it as like kind of this, you know, childhood problem, stuff like that. But in another sense, you know, like kind of, it's funny because it's really nature, you know, like kind of taking over then, you know, like kind of, it's this kind of need that in any, you know, clump of people and stuff like that, they're going to basically sort themselves and different individuals are going to seek dominance and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. I mean, that's exactly what kind of bullying is really. It's a natural reaction to the environment where, you know, there's a huge range of physical sizes of people and a lot more sort of, lot less more, you know, flexibility and rules that allow you to get away with behavior that you certainly wouldn't when you're an adult. So, yeah.
Because once we get to the adult world, there is such a thing as civil law, and like kind of, you know, like where the idea is that, you know, like kind of might isn't necessarily right and stuff. It's like kind of, you know, that you need to have, you know, rule of law, like kind of that you know, civilized society, you know, we have to have you know, due process to kind of, you know, for you to basically prevail over your what's called the enemies and stuff.
Yeah, and if you hit someone around the head with a stick, you're going to end up in court, you know.
Civilized society, you know, we have to have you know, due process to kind of, you know, for you to basically prevail over your what's called the enemies and stuff.
Yeah, and if you hit someone around the head with a stick, you're going to end up in court, you know. It's simple. So yeah, but it's it's funny because you don't want to, as I say, it's one of those things you don't want to kind of let your try and restrict everything that your kids do, and even kids in a group want to do. But yeah, I mean, they can be, you know, considerably evil given half a chance, you know, if you give them free enough reign to do so. I think so.
Yeah, it's
some do anyway.
That's basically, you know, like kind of the theme of Lord of the Flies. That, you know, yeah, I mean, it's not even a matter of boys will be boys, but boys will be dirty, filthy animals. I mean, you know, given the chance and stuff.
Yeah. Well, you know, you can hope they won't.
It's interesting how like what also Matt Reeves sees, you know, looks to do is basically recreate this the atmosphere that, you know, was done in Sweden stuff. Here we have Los Angeles, New Mexico, which in wintertime is very much like what they portrayed though, like, you know, that like it's very remote, you know, it's not a very big city, you know, which, you know, apparently like kind of a suburb of Stockholm would be and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I mean, for the most part, you know, they really do just do a good job of kind of, you know, basically moving, you know, more or less the key elements and even the atmosphere into this other setting in the remake.
Yeah, that actually threw me off when I first started watching it, because I saw this thing kind of saying New Mexico, Los Alamos. So I thought, oh, right, this is the place they were before. It must have been really hot and they had to go somewhere like Boston or somewhere. But no, I had no idea that it gets that cold in New Mexico at all. It was quite interesting for me.
Yeah. It's funny how this you wouldn't think of the southwest part of the country as, you know, like kind of, you know, anywhere that, you know, because it's certainly in California, like, you know, just even today, we had a little bit of rain, you know, like kind of earlier or whatever, but then now we're back to like kind of, you know, sun and kind of, you know, the warmer weather, stuff like that. But there's something about that part though, like kind of once you get, you know, on the eastern side or like kind of the, you know, the bottom part of the Rockies and stuff like that, it's still like kind of, definitely. I mean, you know, places like Flagstaff, whatever, you'll definitely see like snowfall this time of year and stuff like that. It's just something about kind of just, you know, that part of the country that is just not quite microclimates, but kind of there's different pockets of like kind of. I think part of it is that like it's higher elevation, that like, you know, because it is by the Rockies and stuff, and so that kind of tends to, you know, make for the more wintry kind of atmosphere.
Well, I've been in Colorado in the winter, and that was freezing. So yeah,
yeah,
I'm aware of that.
Definitely.
Yeah. Was there? I mean, one thing I didn't like in this remake was the fact that they gave Abby, in this case, a kind of a deep, kind of weird male demonic voice. In the beginning, she's kind of shouting something at the father, and you're hearing it through it sounds like a man rather than. But yeah, I thought that was a bit much. You could have just not done that, really.
I mean, they're really kind of. That was another thing they were trying to emulate, it seems, from the original. I mean, it wasn't as heightened. I think. I don't know, because I think it wasn't as masculine stuff. It was a like kind of a voice actor, that was a woman, stuff like that. That was even though she had a deeper voice, but it wasn't like it still sounded very much feminine instead of like kind of here, like you said, it's more of almost like a male kind of demonic voice and stuff.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that's maybe going back to the original source material or something like that. Something. Yeah, but yeah. Aside from that, I thought it was pretty serviceable. I'm trying to think if there was any. I mean, a lot of the shots, I would say, were kind of more colourful and less monochromatic than the original. But there was so much that was similar to the original. It's very hard to sort of talk about the differences that much, actually, because it was quite a similar movie, really.
Well, they didn't have the minor characters, which kind of had a interesting element, I think, in the original. Like you said, they had the one Locke guy who, kind of was acting like a community detective. So, but here in this case, they had an actual detective, which we should mention was played by Elias Koteas, who, we'll be seeing him again in the Teenage Ninja Mutant Turtles original. He's quite a one of those character actors that seems to show up from time to time and stuff. And then the other kind of characters in the original had this kind of, they were almost like not quite comical, but they kind of funny quirks and stuff like that. There's the one guy with the cats, and that was something that like kind of left down the remake and stuff. That was like a really bizarre scene.
That was. I did enjoy the woman being like attacked by cats. I thought that was. That was like a completely new piece of vampire lore that I was unaware of.
Right.
Any new vampire can be devoured by a horde of cats. That was. But I mean, that was kind of what was charming about the original. They had these kind of weird characters in their sort of strange village, and they had sort of odd scenes like that, and the Rubik's Cube and various other things. All kind of. It just had a lot more kind of odd sort of personality to it than the remake. But then again, I would say the remake did feel kind of pretty competently paced. It wasn't kind of slow at all. It kind of went. It got the job done relatively efficiently and quickly, and kind of held your interest through most of it. So I think I didn't really think there was the naturalistic kind of relationship between Abby and Owen that there was in the original. It didn't have that sort of that clever kind of naturalistic feeling of dialogue between the two 12-year-olds. And I think that's what really kind of elevates the original, because you can, if you kind of have it in the back of your mind, especially, looking at it reflectively afterwards, that, she's a 200-year-old kind of predator that's looking for a new minion. All of her sort of performance, because would be an act more or less, was that much cleverer in a way. So, I think, of course, they didn't show the relationship with the dad at all, which I think was a major loss of the remake, because I think the scene of him going and visiting his dad, like I said, where he's got a friend and you learn that he's an alcoholic, is really effective. In this one, they blame the divorce more on the mother's sort of religious beliefs, fanaticism, unlike the original, which was due to the alcoholism. But I think in a way it loses a lot of the point, because I even think about the title and Let the Right One In, and you can kind of, what is that actually saying as a title? It's kind of, in a way, I kind of go back to Oskar as a character who's kind of just letting the right bully into his life in a way. It's like, it's either Ellie, not the other one, And likewise, from Ellie's perspective, let the right one in is like letting the right one in to trust you enough to know who you are, to ensure that they'll get the job done for you, or or be that kind of like devout minion. So I think that's why you can kind of look at that as a title and how it sort of plays for both characters. Whereas it doesn't have that. There isn't that kind of depth with Owen's character in the remake.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting point too. We kind of talked to her about her like need to survive and stuff like that, but like finding the right person to, because what we see also like kind of in the dramatic kind of bathtub scene that's kind of repeated, she's very vulnerable in that condition when she's sleeping during the day and stuff like that. So unless she's got somebody who can protect her during the day, she's toast. And so it's I mean it's on the one hand they're kind of quote unquote a minion and doing the bidding, stuff like that, but the other they're also protector. They're very much like kind of by day like kind of the only real thing keeping staying the way between the outside world and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I think as a character she has a very delicate balance to strike with whoever this person is going to be, because of course there is the scene that's kind of the name that echoes mirrors the namesake of the movie where she says, you have to invite me in order for me to come in. He says, oh, what happens if you don't? And she literally sort of starts bleeding to death in front of his eyes, which is kind of this thing where it's more like a bigger statement on the relationship that she needs from this person, in that she needs their permission to be the monster, and she needs them to support her sort of evil acts of survival, basically. And in a way, I mean, it's kind of, you can say, okay, she's just killing to survive, but she is pretty evil because she needs to manipulate various people in order to survive this way. So it's kind of this whole, manipulation as survival is kind of her watchwords of her personality, really. Well, that's how she survives. So.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it's interesting how, again, we on the surface we forget that like it's not just two kids and stuff like that. It's this 100-200-year-old like kind of vampire that looks like a kid and stuff like that, and like kind of this kid who's slowly going to become like kind of grow into like the next what's called Thomas, I guess, and stuff, and so and I think that's interesting also is the aspect that like we as the audience know this, and Abby knows this and Ellie knows this and stuff like that, but the kid kind of doesn't know this and stuff like that. He's just kind of basically doing the Morse code thing and wanting to kind of basically have this budding romance kind of continue and stuff like that, and it's all kind of very innocent until the fact that like like maybe he's beating up bullies and stuff like that, but he hasn't had to kill anybody yet, but that's coming.
Yeah, I think I mean it's kind of he's a very sort of vulnerable character, really. Very much a kind of a victim who's kind of wetting himself and doing all sorts of things, and but I guess you get this impression with him that he's had to go through so much that he's completely kind of switched off from it all, especially in the original, I would say. Maybe not so much in the remake, but there's things like when the bullies are like beating his face, he's almost like unresponsive in that like this is, I'm so removed from how I should be feeling that this is just something that's happening.
Yeah, one little detail that they put in the remake I thought was interesting was him collecting these stories. Oh, I guess it was the original. These stories, like kind of these killings and stuff like that, almost like one of the things they talk about with serial killers too is like they like to kind of collect trophies and stuff, and it's almost like he's and so in this case kind of it's Oskar that like has the makings, I guess, of a serial killer or something like that, and I don't know if like in that case Ellie like kind of saw that somehow and basically like identified like kind of he'll make a good prospect for my future minion.
Yeah, no, it's very true, and it's, I guess that is what is clever about the remake, is that the opening scene has him wearing a mask and wielding a knife.
Right,
he looks
right.
like a kid American Psycho.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, and you have him in the original stabbing this tree, and it's almost, and I think that they do this more effectively in the original, in that you don't get the impression that he wants to have revenge on the bullies out of a real anger. You don't see him sort of like getting really, really angry about these kids. It's more like it's affected his pride of who he, or his self-image, rather than an emotional kind of thing. So it's a very cold kind of emotional thing where he's practicing stabbing the tree.
Right.
Things like this. You kind of, and that is very much in keeping with a kind of a serial killer, sociopath kind of personality, I think. And maybe in a way, their relationship is that Ellie exercises that kind of killing part of his, or the part of him that he wanted to enact for him in a way.
They did have that in the original, though. Now that when you said that, I'm remembering about the scene where she says something about you need to have part of me and you and stuff like that, or something to that effect. It's almost like and that's what's interesting. Unlike the typical vampire movies where there's something mystical happening, whatever. There doesn't seem to be any of that. It's just very very much blood and guts, very visceral. But in that moment, though, I could swear that the way they depict it too was like you see almost her ancient self and everything like that, as he's saying it to her. But other than that, there wasn't really much that was supernatural. It was kind of just almost like that she was kind of almost injecting him with some of her spirit, or something like that.
That was, I couldn't quite, maybe it was just because I was watching it on a dark TV or sometimes, but I couldn't work out if they had actually used some kind of effect to make her sort of very temporarily look much, much older in some of those scenes where she's talking to him.
Because in the casting, they actually have, that they they list as Suzanne Rubin as the aged Ellie and stuff like that. So I think that was what they did was they kind of basically, I think with some kind of imaging, whatever, they kind of just basically put her face over, Ellie's and stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was very subtly done and very effective because it was quite haunting. It didn't really obviously hit me at all. And they didn't do anything like that with the remake either. It was just effects, really, wasn't it? So, but I thought that was a really, really clever thing because you just pointed it out to me. But I really enjoyed it.
But it's just really that idea, though, that that he, just was almost kind of ripe for her to kind of basically, put more almost like a, I think it was almost like a virus or, kind of where, kind of the killing, RNA, if you will, so would need to be injected into him and stuff like that, and that was the way she did it.
You could say that kind of starts with what's kind of spooky about that is that when her response to the bullies is that you need to hit them harder than you'd ever dare, right?
Right.
Because I think in some respects, you can interpret that, and this is what's kind of clever about the movie, is that you can either interpret that as her trying to help him protect himself, or you could interpret it as she's trying to foster this violence in him so that he's used to it when he gets to see her doing it.
Yeah.
And also on a sort of another angle on it, you can say they're kind of playing a trick with us, with the audience, because a lot of people would say, oh yeah, that's what you need to do to a bully, is you need to really whack them hard and then they'll stop bullying you. Which may not be the case, as you've seen in this movie. If she never says to him, hey, go and tell the teacher or tell your parents. She's just no, just hit them really hard around the head with a stick. That'll sort them out.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, you could say it's maybe this kind of thing of grooming his appetite for violence in a way, perhaps. but there's not really. That's really the only scene I could really attribute that to. So the other one I thought was really interesting, and I thought, oh man, this is almost like world building, right for a sequel or something. Is the bit where we go and see her collection of toys and puzzles and things.
That's true.
And you have this thing where she says, "Oh, you sold that egg, you could buy and it's a very interesting word to use, but she says like a power station or a power plant."
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that was a really interesting thing, really interesting term, because she doesn't say like, you could buy like a mansion or like a pile of gold. It's like a power plant, which means that her core value is her power, a sort of, visceral power over reality. And so I like, there's a scene where he kind of touches, I don't know if she touches the air, or he does, and it kind of just falls to pieces, and there's all these weird rings that are kind of embedded in it, and then and I kind of saw that as a kind of symbolism for obviously him getting to know her kind of inner secrets, but in a kind of a weird visual kind of thing, but also perhaps this kind of thing, a question of her femininity, or is she a girl, is she a boy, I didn't actually know at that point from having to go back and reading about the source material, but I kind of got that as a sort of a statement on for sort of a fractured femininity to do with her character, perhaps.
Yeah, I guess probably the last interesting point maybe that is worth talking about is the fact that, like, on the one hand, she's telling him that, hey, I'm not a girl or something like that.
Yeah.
And, like, she's like, basically, she's like, starts off saying, actually, in both cases, both the original and remake, hey, we can't be friends. At each point, she's like trying to put him off almost and stuff. But, like, is that seduction, or is that kind of, like, kind of basically, she's being honest and looking at everything. And then meanwhile, besides like kind of her, like, kind of grooming this future, kind of serial killer, so to speak, he's not stopping. He's like kind of, just, whatever she's dangling, he's going forward and stuff like that. You're not a girl, okay? You gotta, you're ancient, okay? He doesn't stop. I mean, like kind of, like whether it's Oskar or Owen and stuff like that, they're basically moving forward into this life that, like, a servitude to this kind of being that needs to be fed blood.
I know, right? Well, I mean, I think as well as I think he's obviously sort of, he lacks any kind of moral guidance that he can identify with in his life, and I think he just is. I think he sort of lusts for and desires power somewhere in his personality, as sort of innocent and victim-like that he as he comes across in the story. He's actually really, he gets off on her power, and wants that kind of power himself, I think, ultimately. So yeah, it's a weird kind of teenage love story about two serial killers, really. I suppose you can look at it in one way. Yeah.
So any more thoughts about, like, kind of that we've talked about having a possible Chloe Moretz season of remakes and stuff?
Yes, as we were researching into this, we realized that Chloe Grace Moretz is almost like the queen, I suppose, playing with this movie a bit here.
Right.
But the queen of remakes, because she's been in a string of horror remakes.
Yeah.
So we were thinking of doing a month or thereabouts of Chloe Moretz horror remakes. So this will be the first of many.
So yeah, definitely. We've got as mentioned, everything from Amityville horror to what's called Addams Family to
Suspiria.
Yeah. So definitely, that's three right there, and there's actually more. So we'll just start with that for now. Oh, and Carrie, that's of course the major one where she's the lead and stuff like that. So we can't miss that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's coming up, and once again, I'm John Chang with Dan Edmonds, and we will see you at the movies.